She'd been sitting on that bench since noon, hands stiff around the letter that had brought her this far. Ash Hollow wasn't the kind of town that welcomed anyone new, especially not a woman who arrived alone with a trunk and a promise that no longer seemed to exist. Mara Linton had crossed 3 states on a stagecoach that smelled of sweat and fear, holding on to the single idea that somewhere ahead, a man named Elias Crow was waiting for her. But as the hours dragged and the crowd thinned, that idea started to feel like another cruel joke the world had played on her. She'd known disappointment before, too many times to count. A life of almosts and not enoughs. Once, back in Kansas, she'd worked in a sewing shop, stitching wedding dresses for girls younger and prettier, girls who never looked her way. When her father died and the debts came calling, the letters from the agency had seemed like mercy. A rancher seeking a wife, honest pay, a home. She'd said yes because what else was there left to say? Now, as the sun dropped behind the dry hills, the letter in her hand meant nothing. No one had come. Not the man. Not a word. Just the wind kicking dust around her boots and the smell of stale bread from the saloon across the street. She told herself she wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of the townsfolk watching from their porches, pretending not to stare. She'd seen pity before. It was worse than cruelty. So she straightened her back, pressed her lips together, and told herself she'd wait until the next coach out. She could find work somewhere, maybe laundry, maybe kitchens. She'd survived worse. Then came a voice, soft, small, and so close she almost missed it. "Can you stay, Mama?" Her heart stuttered. Mara turned, and there she was, a little girl, no older than 6, brown braids tangled by wind, eyes the color of quiet grief. The child held a wooden doll with one arm missing and looked up at her like she'd found something lost. "I'm sorry," Mara whispered, unsure if she'd heard right. The girl blinked, tears trembling on her lashes. "You look like my mama." For a moment, Mara couldn't breathe. All her practiced calm fell away. She wanted to reach out but didn't dare. She'd seen the kind of pain that lived behind a child's eyes when love had been taken too soon. Then a shadow fell across the dirt. Boots, tall, worn, steady. The man was broad-shouldered, his face unshaven, his expression somewhere between sorrow and disbelief. Elias Crow. He knelt beside the girl, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Lydia," he murmured, voice low and rough. "She's not—" He stopped, glancing up at Mara. The words died on his tongue. Whatever he'd meant to say, guilt swallowed it whole. Mara saw it then, the truth in his eyes. He was the one who'd written that letter. He was the one who'd changed his mind. The silence between them stretched like a wire about to snap. She could almost hear the things they weren't saying. His regret, her shame, the child's fragile hope binding them all in a moment too heavy to hold. Finally, Elias stood, clearing his throat. "It's a long ride back to town," he said quietly. "You can stay at the ranch tonight, just until we figure something proper." She wanted to refuse. Every part of her screamed to keep walking, to never let herself hope again. But the little girl was still looking up at her, holding that broken doll tight. So Mara nodded once. "All right." As they walked toward the waiting wagon, the last light of the day slid across the empty street, turning the dust to gold. Behind them, whispers stirred from the porches, half curiosity, half judgment. Mara didn't look back. She just kept walking beside the man who'd forgotten her and the child who already hadn't, and somewhere deep inside, beneath all the hurt and the long miles of disappointment, a voice she hadn't listened to in years whispered back, "Maybe this isn't the end after all." The wind howled all night around the Crow Ranch, carrying the smell of old rain and cold earth. By morning, the silence inside the house was thick enough to hear the ticking of the wall clock and the faint rustle of Lydia's small feet on the floorboards. Mara woke with a start, unsure for a moment where she was. The bed beneath her was too soft, the air too still. Then she remembered. The widower, the little girl, the awkward invitation offered out of guilt rather than kindness. She sat up, brushing the loose hair from her face, and caught sight of herself in the small mirror on the wall. The woman staring back looked like someone halfway between staying and leaving. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted faintly from the kitchen. Mara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and followed the sound of quiet movement. Elias stood by the stove, back turned, shirt sleeves rolled up. He didn't look like a man who knew what to do with company. When he finally glanced her way, it wasn't anger she saw, just weariness carved deep into his face. "There's coffee," he said. "If you want some." She nodded, careful not to sound too grateful. "Thank you." He poured her a cup, set it on the table, and sat opposite her. The silence stretched again, just like in town. Lydia's soft humming drifted in from the next room as she dressed her doll with a strip of torn fabric. "I'm sorry for yesterday," Elias said finally, eyes fixed on his hands. "I should have written. Things changed." Mara gave a small, humorless smile. "They often do." He looked up at that, as if hearing something in her tone that stung. "You don't have to stay," he said. "The storm's passed. Stage will come through next week." "I'll stay till then," she answered simply, sipping her coffee. "I'll earn my keep." He didn't argue. Maybe he didn't know how. By noon, she'd found her way around the house, tidy but tired, like its owner. Dust lined the shelves. Dishes were clean but chipped, curtains faded where sun had long pressed against them. The room across the hall still held a woman's things: a faded shawl on a chair, a comb with strands of golden hair caught in its teeth. She shut the door quietly and didn't open it again. When Lydia tugged her sleeve later, asking to see the chickens, she followed the girl outside. The cold bit through her dress, but Lydia's laughter warmed the air. The child chattered about names she'd given the hens: Mary, Ruth, and one stubborn brown bird called Boss. Mara found herself smiling before she realized it. Elias watched from the porch, hat low over his brow. He'd forgotten how sound could fill the place, how the echo of a child's joy used to soften everything it touched. For months he'd lived in that house like it was a punishment he'd earned. Now watching them, he felt something he couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or Grace sneaking back through a door he'd thought locked for good. That evening, Mara cooked without asking. Just stew and bread, nothing fancy, but the house smelled alive again. Lydia set the table. Elias mumbled a quiet grace, and for the first time since his wife's death, he felt the space between them wasn't hollow. Later, after the dishes were washed, Elias went out to fix a loose fence rail by lantern light. Mara followed, holding the beam steady while he hammered. The rhythm of it, wood, metal, breath, fell into something like peace. When their eyes met, no words passed, but both understood. This wasn't home. Not yet. But neither was it nothing. Mara turned toward the house first, the lamplight catching her face for just a second. Elias watched her go, wondering if second chances always arrived looking like mistakes at first, and somewhere behind them, through the thin walls and falling night, Lydia's small voice drifted, soft, content, and humming. Winter came early that year. The mornings froze before the sun had even touched the horizon, and the Crow Ranch turned quiet beneath a white sky. You could almost hear the world breathing if you stood still long enough. Mara had been there nearly 2 months now. The temporary stay had stretched itself into something unspoken, and neither she nor Elias seemed eager to define it. Some days she still caught herself wondering how it had happened. How a stranger's house, once filled with ghosts, could start feeling less like a place to endure and more like a place to rest. Each morning began the same. Elias started the fire. Lydia carried kindling. Mara stirred the pot and filled the room with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. The three of them moved like clockwork now, without needing to speak. Still, some silences carried weight. Elias had stopped wearing his wedding band sometime in late December. Mara noticed, though he didn't mention it. The tan line still marked his finger, pale and sharp against work-hardened skin. She never asked, but it lingered in her thoughts whenever their hands brushed by accident passing a plate or a tool. He'd been fixing the barn roof that morning, hammer echoing across the frozen field, when Lydia ran inside to fetch her mother. That wasn't. "Pa says the nails keep splitting," she said breathlessly. Mara smiled, pulling on her shawl. "Then we'll see if supper can wait." Outside, the cold hit her like a slap, clean, sharp, alive. Elias looked down from the ladder, shaking his head. "You don't need to be out here." She picked up a stray board and held it steady anyway. "Maybe I want to be." He smirked faintly, not in mockery but surprise. "You're stubborn." "I've been called worse." The exchange was light, simple, but it landed somewhere deeper than either expected. For a moment, the air between them wasn't cold at all. That evening, after the roof was done, the three of them sat by the fire. Lydia dozed against Mara's lap, her small hand gripping a rag doll that had lost its other arm. Elias watched them quietly, a book open but unread in his hands. "She used to hum that same tune," he said finally, almost to himself. Mara glanced up. "Your wife?" He nodded. "When she brushed Lydia's hair. I keep expecting her to walk through that door some nights." There was nothing to say to that, not really. Grief wasn't something you fixed. It was something you learned to carry without letting it crush you. Mara knew that better than most. She'd buried both her parents before 20 and spent years stitching other women's happiness into gowns she'd never wear. So she just said softly, she must have loved her very much. Elias's jaw tightened. She did. But I think she'd want her to laugh again. They sat in the quiet that followed, long, steady, not uncomfortable. The fire cracked softly, and outside the wind bent through the eaves like an old song. Later, when Mara stood to carry Lydia to bed, Elias rose too, taking the child gently from her arms. Their hands brushed again. This time neither looked away. When Mara turned toward her small room, she paused at the door and glanced back. He was tucking the blanket under his daughter's chin with such care that her chest ached just watching. In the half-light of the fire, he looked up, caught her watching, and didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence had changed shape. It no longer kept them apart. That night, long after the house had gone still, Mara lay awake listening to the soft rhythm of the wind against the shutters. Somewhere beneath it, she could almost hear the echo of her own heart answering back. Quiet, steady, and for the first time in years, not afraid. By the time the snow began to melt, Ash Hollow had already found something new to talk about. And this time it wasn't the weather. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it carried the scent of scandal. A widow's ranch, a mail-order bride who never left, a child calling her mama. People didn't need much truth to build a story. By spring, Mara's name had found its way into every whispered porch conversation and every sideways glance down Main Street. She could feel it the moment she stepped into the general store, eyes turning, voices softening to a murmur that filled the air like flies. She didn't let it show. She'd learned long ago that silence was stronger than protest. But that didn't stop the sting. When she reached the counter, Mr. Halpern cleared his throat. "Morning, Mrs. Crow." She froze. "It's Miss Linton." His smile faltered. "Course. Just habit, I guess." The word hung heavy. Habit. That's what they thought she'd become. A habit the widower hadn't managed to break. Elias arrived later that afternoon, hands still stained with soil from spring planting. He'd heard it too. She could tell by the tightness in his shoulders. "They'll move on," he said, avoiding her eyes. "No," she answered quietly. "They won't." He looked up then, finally meeting her gaze. "You don't know these people." "I know enough," she said, voice steady. "I've seen the way they look at me." Something inside him snapped, not in anger, but in shame. He rubbed his temples, sighing. "You shouldn't have come to town alone. People talk." "Then maybe you should have walked beside me," she said, the words out before she could stop them. Silence fell. The air between them turned brittle. He turned toward the door, jaw set. "Don't make this harder than it already is." Her chest tightened. "Harder for who, Elias? For you or for me?" That was when he said it. Words that would stay with her long after she left. "She'll be leaving soon." He didn't shout. He didn't even look at her when he said it. Just tossed it over his shoulder as a few townsmen nearby pretended not to listen. It was meant to protect her, maybe, or protect himself, but either way, it cut clean. That night, back at the ranch, she packed her things. Quietly, carefully, the same way she had lived. Lydia found her at the doorway, clutching her doll. "Are we going somewhere, Mama?" Mara knelt, her voice barely holding steady. "No, sweetheart, you stay. You've got roots here." The child's eyes filled, confusion blooming into panic. "But you said—" "I know," she whispered, brushing the hair from her face. "Sometimes we have to leave before we're asked to." The door behind her creaked. Elias stood there, hat in hand, face shadowed by regret that came too late. "You don't have to go." She didn't turn. "Don't I?" The question hung between them like smoke, curling and vanishing before either could breathe. Outside, the night had fallen quiet except for the wind sweeping across the field. She stepped onto the porch, her suitcase light, just a few clothes, a letter never sent, a handful of hope she hadn't yet learned to throw away. Elias followed her as far as the fence. He wanted to speak, to say stay, but pride and guilt tangled his tongue. Mara stopped by the wagon, looking out toward the dark horizon. "I wasn't here for a name, Elias," she said softly. "Only a place to belong." Then she climbed up, and the wagon rolled forward. The wheels cracked the dry earth, slow and final. Elias stood there long after she'd disappeared, the fields stretching empty before him. The wind blew hard enough to sting his eyes, but he didn't move. He just watched the dust settle where she'd been, and wondered if silence had ever cost a man so much. By the time Elias found her again, spring had already softened into early summer. The land was green now, quiet in a way that made regret sound louder than thunder. He'd spent weeks searching every back road, asking at stage stops, following faint rumors, the woman teaching letters at the mission school, the one with the dark shawl and the calm eyes. Each time someone nodded, his heart kicked like a startled horse. When he finally reached the small clapboard building on the edge of Ash Creek, he didn't know what he'd say. What could a man possibly offer after letting silence drive away the only peace he'd known? The schoolhouse door stood open. Inside, children's voices rose and fell in crooked rhythm, reciting the alphabet. And there, by the blackboard, hair pinned neatly, sleeves rolled, was Mara. Her voice was low, patient, steady. The sound of someone who'd learned that healing didn't need to be loud. When class ended, she turned and froze. Elias stood by the doorway, hat in hand, his eyes saying everything his mouth still didn't know how to. "You found the place," she said quietly. "I've been looking since the day you left." Her expression didn't soften right away. "And why now, Elias?" He swallowed. "Because I can't stand another morning where her laugh isn't in that house. Or another night knowing I'm the fool who chased away the only woman who ever made it feel like home again." Mara's hand trembled as she gathered the children's books. "It's a little late for apologies. I'm not asking forgiveness," he said. "Just a chance to make things right." A sudden burst of laughter broke from outside, the kind only a child can make without thinking. Lydia came running from the wagon, her hair flying, her doll clutched tight. "Mama!" The word hung between them, startling, tender, certain. Mara knelt instinctively, catching the girl in her arms. The child's small arms wrapped around her neck, squeezing with all the strength her little body had. Elias's voice broke when he spoke again. "She hasn't stopped asking for you." For a long moment, no one said anything. The wind brushed through the open doorway, carrying the scent of lilacs and warm earth. Mara finally stood, still holding Lydia's hand. "What would you have me do, Elias?" He stepped closer, the years of loneliness etched across his face. "Come home. Not as a guest, not as a favor, just come home." The silence that followed wasn't cold this time. It was heavy with something living, something almost new. She studied him for a long moment, eyes searching for the man who'd once stood silent as she walked away. What she saw wasn't pride anymore. It was humility, quiet and raw. "Then let's not waste what's been given twice," she said softly. By dusk, the wagon rolled back down the road toward Ash Hollow. The townsfolk watched from porches again, but no one whispered this time. Some nodded. Some smiled faintly. The world has a way of softening when people choose grace over gossip. At the Crow Ranch, the fields were alive with color. Lydia ran ahead, chasing fireflies that glowed against the fading light. Mara lingered at the porch steps, her hand brushing the doorframe that had once felt like a boundary. Now it felt like belonging. Elias set her small trunk down inside, the wood floor creaking softly. "You're home now," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Mara looked around the room, the table she'd once set, the chair by the fire, the place that had held so much silence, and finally smiled. "Yes," she said, turning toward him. "I am." Outside, the last light of day spilled across the valley, warm and golden, like the world itself had finally decided to forgive.